What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the terms are deep state. Oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy the
Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101, the place where we all hear live and direct from people in the news, in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. I'm Jeff Browning, and we're grateful to you for being here. Today, we're very excited to release part of a conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we had with Fiona Hill. She's a former official on the U.S. National Security Council specializing in Russian and European affairs. She's advised numerous U.S. presidents on foreign policy in the region, and she's particularly knowledgeable, for example, about the thinking, feelings, and actions of Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader who has in the past ordered his government to carry out internet operations against the American political system and against us as Americans, trying to turn us against each other. During her time advising Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump, Fiona took a hard line against Russia, keeping a hawkish eye over their actions and advocating for responses that demonstrated U.S. strength and resolve. During President Trump's administration, she had a difficult time convincing the president to go along with this. Trump himself at times seemed to have a much more warm and welcoming approach to Putin, and on top of this, Russia was pleased to see the United States experiencing such division and difficulty at home. After all, when we're fighting amongst ourselves, we let our guard down and can't act as effectively on the international stage. Many people first became familiar with Fiona when she was asked by Congress to testify during the Trump impeachment hearings. She shared incredible thoughts and analysis with us on where the country is today, the threats we face, and where we're going. It was an incredible conversation with fantastic audience Q&A, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we did. As always, if you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live or pm101.club. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Can you identify maybe some areas where the U.S. and Russia can cooperate to quell tensions? I'm thinking there was a report of a surprising proposal from General Milley to open up a joint U.S.-Russia military base in Central Asia. Are there other types of areas where we can find cooperation? And was that just foolhardy?
No, look, I think that there are other ways in which we can get cooperation, and we also should be trying to aim towards that, because I think there's no reason why we should be in a constant state of confrontation with the Russians. Many people listening to this, obviously are pretty well aware, just as I am and everybody else is, about the nature of Russia's intervention in our politics in 2016, the hacking of so many U.S. systems, all the assassination attempts that the Russians have launched, and sometimes very successful ones, against opposition figures, interventions, the annexation in Syria and also in the Middle East, the annexation of Crimea. I mean, there's a whole list of pretty negative Russian activities here, and as I said earlier, Russian sees us as the main antagonist and the main opponent in the global affairs. There's still this worldview, this hangover from the kind of Cold War, and the people around Putin who see the United States in a rather negative light. And while they continue to pose a threat in this sort of rather insidious way in terms of these political interventions and the sort of dirty tricks that they've been indulging in for quite some time now, and they don't want to kind of back down from this in a way, because Putin is also mobilizing on the domestic front against the United States, saying that we're kind of a threat to his domestic situation, not just through regime change, but that we constantly try to pressure Russia. I often think that if we disappeared tomorrow, the Russians would have to invent us, because then there wouldn't be a real justification why Putin stays in power, or why they maintain a very large military, because they're like everybody else focused on China, but they want to have a positive relationship with China. It just makes the whole situation extremely complicated. So to say the least, very complicated. So really what we have to try to do here is figure out, can we change that trajectory? So are there areas, like General Milley or others are suggesting, that might be suspicious in some way for a change, that we could show and demonstrate that we can work together on something? I think, climate change is a possibility. There's been a lot in the press recently about methane emissions, the flaring of gas from oil production, for example, but also natural gas methane emissions from beneath permafrost in places like Russia, and some of the kind of problems that Russia's going to face as the climate changes are going to be similar to ours, but on an even larger scale. Methane emissions in Russia and the United States are some of the largest, in fact, the largest in the world. So we might have a vested interest in sort of capturing that gas as a fuel source, but also in terms of preventing further emission into the atmosphere and contributing towards global warming. The United States and the US could work together, on capping gas flares in oil fields, for example, or figuring out ways together, technological ways of addressing methane emissions from melting permafrost or in the the Arctic seas. We've also got incredible problems with fires. Just as we had these huge fires out west this past summer, the Russians have been contending with fires on even larger scale out in Siberia. And different points we've talked about mutual assistance on firefighting and firefighting techniques. We could start thinking about something along those lines. Again, that's in climate change, the future of the Arctic. We're both Arctic powers, and often we've cooperated surprisingly well in the Arctic region. And as the Arctic is getting more heavily affected and more quickly by climate change than any other part of the northern hemisphere, again, there may be some room for cooperation, collaborative ventures there. And then, of course, there's pandemic. That's been actually, I have to say, a bit of a disappointment from mine and many other perspectives. We've collaborated with the Russians in the past on vaccines and on infectious diseases, and we could have done better this time around. We still may have an opportunity because the Russians are not faring well with COVID this last few weeks. They've had the highest infection rates and the highest mortality rates of any point during the pandemic. So there might still be an opportunity there looking forward. But I think we need to be creative, because it's not going to do anybody any good to have this confrontational, always on the brink of a massive crisis, and always, even in the brink of some military encounter, continuing on into the future.
And now I want to move to another obviously massive policy issue. U.S. policy has become increasingly focused on China. We have populists on the left, populists on the right, really making this a focus. President Biden is making it a focus. But there's also, for everybody in the audience, a strong difference of opinion among key IR scholars, whether they're from the realist view, the constructivist view, liberal view, about how Russia will approach a rising China and what that means for U.S. strategy. How do you assess the relationship between Russia and China? Maybe what they're trying to accomplish, and asking you to dig into your bag, grab out your crystal ball, what you think will ultimately come of it.
Well, I think Russia's already made a choice to try to forge as close a partnership as it possibly can with China. I think the problem for Russia is that China may not over the longer term be quite so enthused. So, I referred earlier to the fact if the United States didn't exist, that Russia may be forced to sort of invent it as a mobilizational object, as a kind of image of the enemy, because the Russians don't want to be alone with China in a kind of a world in which, something like the United States doesn't exist. And it's not that they're kind of trying to balance off the US versus China, but they want to kind of convince the Chinese that they're kind of in the same boat, really. With both Russia's, we both, Russia and China, as the story would go, have the same problem, the United States. the United States is trying to constrain you, China, as you rise economically and militarily. We've got sanctions from the United States applied against both of us. We're best suited to join forces to push back against this. Because for Russia, and this is where a bit of the kind of crystal ball comes in, there's a lot of anxiety on the horizon with China, because in the past, the Sino-Soviet relationship, in other words, the Russian-China relationship, has been rocky. During the Soviet period, and the period of Mao and Communist China, there was pretty much of a divergence of systems. They weren't always on the same page there. And in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there were clashes over territory. Large swathes of the Russian Far East, basically east of Lake Baikal, north of the Amur River, were at one point under the sovereignty of China, until about the 1860s, when the Russian Empire sort of expanded into that territory. China was going through a rough patch, and the Russian Empire absorbed that territory. And it's not that Chinese nationalists have forgotten that. Just like there was a great desire to take back Hong Kong from the 99-year lease from the Brits that was imposed upon China. There's also a desire to, of course, bring back Taiwan. We're seeing all of that playing out right now. And then, what does that mean about other lost lands or lands that they would like to reclaim? Not at all impossible to envisage a more nationalistic, muscular, confident China starting to kind of put pressure on Russia about those territories. And there has already been some movement of Chinese entrepreneurs into there, and people leasing land in the Russian Far East. And it's just a big discrepancy in terms of the demography and the kind of economic activity between north of the Amur River and these very sparsely populated Russian territories, and south of the Amur River and Heilongjiang and largely populated urbanized provinces of China. And we did see quite recently clashes between India and China in the Himalayas over a similar land dispute in a pretty rocky, icy place where you would think that there wasn't much value there, but obviously strategically, for China, making sure that it has as much claim to its borders and lost territories as possible is pretty significant there. Russia also hasn't been particularly thrilled, getting back to the subject of the Arctic again, about China moving on into the Arctic. China has declared itself a near Arctic power. That looks pretty far away from the Arctic Circle for anybody looking on a map, of course. But China has evinced a pretty serious interest in polar exploration, not just in the Arctic, but also in the Antarctic, where Russia, along with the United States and New Zealand and a bunch of other powers, have set up scientific establishments and research stations, and China wants in on there too, because obviously there's a great mineral wealth and other riches in Antarctica that China's got its eyes on. Same kind of thing up in the Arctic. And then there's Central Asia, where you mentioned about General Milley making some comments about sort of Central Asia. Well, China's now the big economic power in Central Asia. It used to be Russia's stomping ground. Central Asian states were part of the Russian and Soviet empires. And the One Belt, One Road initiative of China has kind of moved very much across Central Asian territory, eclipsing a lot of economic investment by the Russians. And the Russians are trying to now say, well, we're the security providers for Central Asia, but the Chinese are looking, particularly after the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan, more and more at the region and wondering whether they should be perhaps securing it themselves. So those tensions are there, and what the Russians would like to do is to make sure that they can hold China as close as possible, make it very clear to China that they're an indispensable power to have on their side, that there's a partnership. There's a lot of Russian growth, and the economy has been driven by Chinese demand, especially since sanctions from the West, from the US and Europe against Russia. Russia's looked more eastward. But at the same time, the Chinese are, as I said, not that enthused, not so as enthused as Russia is. So Russia may want this partnership with China over the longer term a lot more than China may want it or even need it.
So I'm going to ask you another massive question. We had David Sanger on, who actually teaches a class with Graham Allison. For everybody in the audience, that's one of your mentors. He's been a massive driver of political thought in this country, arguably around the world, for years now. But his theory of the Thucydides trap has been at the center of discussion about the rise of China and great power competition in the 21st century. Professor Allison suggests, paraphrasing Thucydides here, that conflict may be inevitable when a rising power challenges an incumbent power. I know that you're a Russia-US expert, but we got to pick your brain. We'd be remiss if we didn't. Do you agree with this theory, especially as it concerns China, the US, and a potentially inevitable conflict?
Look, there's a real risk of that. And it's also because we start talking about it as inevitable, right? We're starting to get ourselves into that confrontational mindset. And that kind of gets back to what I was saying about the Russians. That's how they've got themselves with us. Vladimir Putin and some of the people around him, in particular in the military and the security service, are convinced we're out to get them, so they want to get us first. And once they get themselves into that mindset, they see everything through the lens of confrontation. And they always assume malign intent on our part, even when we're actually trying to move the relationship off onto a different footing. And then, of course, once they take some sort of action against it, it's the same with China. There start to be kind of a momentum on our part as well, that we kind of see that any overtures are getting rebuffed. We get kind of accused by domestic actors of appeasement or of, kind of naivety. And, there starts to become a kind of a cycle of us feeling that we have to take stronger and stronger action. It's been the same with Russia and the same with China. And we get ourselves, down that kind of path where each of us start to perceive problems with the other and start to second guess our own actions and impute things from the other side's actions that are not really there. And I mean, a classic example of this is during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. I mean, this is when I actually decided to study Russian. So back in the 1980s, we had the standoff over the stationing of intermediate nuclear range missiles in Europe. The SS-20 and the Pershing missiles by the Soviet Union, and then the United States on either sides of the Iron Curtain in Eastern and Western Europe. And we also had a lot of exercises going on, similar to we do now, military exercises, basically planning against contingencies. And the Soviets misread a number of US military maneuvers, naval maneuvers, and sort of set piece movements of our armed forces overall, and became convinced that we were preparing to launch a first nuclear strike against them. They started looking for signs all over the place. And, the kind of tension was palpable in the relationship. But we were, lucky in some regard, because when Ronald Reagan, that the Soviets actually genuinely believed that the United States was going to strike them first, he kind of pulled back a bit and decided that this was, obviously very evidently a disaster waiting to happen, and that, he should try to reach out. And that's, of course, what happened with the Gorbachev-Reagan symmetry. Reagan recognized that everybody was reading a lot into it, and we were on a confrontational path because they were misreading, and then we were misreading in return. And, on the other side, then later there's, Gorbachev comes in. And, there's an effort by Gorbachev and Reagan both to try to change the situation. So, yes, indeed, there is the Thucydides trap, but you can also pull yourself out of it if you kind of realize where things are heading. And if there's a realization that it could be not just mutually damaging, but potentially disastrous. But I think, part of the problem is we talk ourselves into it and we see things as inevitable. And, knowing Graham Allison, Professor Allison, of course, he wrote that with the precise intent to frame things in a certain way so we could see the risks, not just, kind of in a historical context, but also in the context of the present.
And, well, what a great job he did. We've had multiple people on discussing the Thucydides trap, whether it be authors or politicians. But now I want to pivot a little bit more into some of the topics that you touched on in your book, and especially hope that you can bring that optimism that you just shared there with us to these next few questions, which really keep anyone working in politics with a good conscience up at night. So you've been in 3 U.S. administrations. You've also raised the alarm bells about the devastating impact of partisan polarization in America. I'm wondering if you could speak to the impact that partisan polarization has had on our military and national security institutions, and specifically, have our appointed officials over the 3 administrations that you've served in become more partisan? And maybe even, I'm more curious about this, have our civil service members become more polarized and partisan?
Well, I mean, I'll just start where you ended there. I mean, I don't think that our members of our civil service have become more polarized and partisan, but there's certainly been accusations that they have. And in fact, my personal experience over the last several years has been that in this highly partisan, highly polarized, highly charged political atmosphere, there's kind of an expectation of people, it's a bit like the kind of political Thucydides trap, that everybody has to be partisan and that nobody can be objective and non-partisan. I mean, you're, valiantly attempting to show that you can be non-partisan with this podcast. And I myself have been, trying, very hard to basically demonstrate that you don't have to take ideological political positions to be politically engaged and to be able to speak out on things. And that, party affiliation isn't everything. But during the Trump administration, for example, there was an accusation that everybody in the government was a Democrat or a closet Democrat or a hidden Democrat, actively acting against the president. That just was not the case. And, public servants in the United States have been noted for their ability to stay above the fray, the political fray. But we have seen, very sadly, the politicization of national security and foreign policy and defense policy in ways that this was not the case before. We used to say that domestic policy stopped at the border, meaning that it didn't spill over and partisan fighting into matters of the state on foreign policy, and certainly not into our national security perspective. There was a shared consensus on that. And unfortunately, we've seen since 2016 in particular, that was not the case. The intervention of the Russians into our electoral system and into the presidential campaign in 2016 really helped to change the whole perspective on this as well, because instead of this being widely recognized as a massive national security crisis and sort of a threat to the United States, it immediately became partisan, because there was this depiction of the Russian intervention being in favor of one candidate. And, the opposing side trying to sort of prove that. And, back and forth we had over this. And of course, the Russians loved it, because then, they were pitting us against each other. We were all fighting about them and their influence on the election, and, not focusing on ourselves or on the shared national security threat. This is, one of the reasons why, I've taken the book in the particular direction that I have, and why I've been so outspoken, because I went into the administration trying to push back against the national security threat, thinking that everybody else was on the same page about the impermissibility of, allowing the Russians to mess about in our domestic politics. What we were going to do to mitigate this, what we were going to do to stop this from happening again. And instead, I saw that people were willing to play with that for partisan benefit on both sides initially, and then it's kind of morphed into something else, much more extreme and much more dangerous. I mean, now I'm more worried about the state of United States democracy, this polarization, the partisan infighting, than I am worried about kind of Russia as a threat. I think this is the greater threat. We have become a national security threat. We're incapable of collective action. We've seen that during the pandemic. Russia itself, we don't even have a shared perspective on how to deal with that. Or China more so, actually, which is kind of interesting. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about why that is. I think it's partly because it's so obvious that China is the sort of system threat. And Russia's made itself very effectively part of our politics through its intervention, part of our domestic politics. Well, basically, we've got to such a state, and obviously I witnessed this during the first impeachment hearings when I was to testify, that especially domestic politics, private political interests has bled into national security affairs. And we've seen, efforts to sort of privatize foreign and national security politics, a policy in, ways for advancing more personal, in some cases, or domestic political goals. And that's something that, we've not really seen before in the past. I mean, yeah, now and again, at different parts of history, but that has really been a change. And like I said, then the idea that everything has a partisan tinge, everything is politicized. Public health issues, not just national security issues. I mean, I really find it incredibly hard to get my head around how masks to stem the transmission of disease have become political, or how having a vaccine is political. When I was growing up in the north of England, many vaccines kind of came into being, and my family, everybody I knew were kind of in line to have those vaccines because so many people in our families had died of infectious disease, what are now preventable childhood diseases. I mean, I grew up, hearing stories about my grandparents' family, their siblings died of things that we can now get a vaccine for. My mother lost part of her hearing from getting measles. I had, relatives who got polio as kids and were crippled. So, it was just seen as actually a privilege to have a vaccine. So it was a privilege of not dying then of a preventable disease. And if, in a public health context, there was some, infectious disease, we'd all take precautions. It wasn't politicized in any way. So we've really kind of got to a state now where every single thing, seems to be the subject for partisan infighting. And the very fact that Americans are trying to divide themselves up by seeing a primary identity being either Republican or Democrat, for those of us who are not and don't see ourselves in that kind of context, we're also starting to, wonder, how do we fit into all this? So, part of the sort of speaking out, writing the book, but sort of put a spotlight on this. And, to also emphasize that, as I learned, and as a national security aspect, that our domestic politics are really now our Achilles heel. Using the old all of these sort of ancient Greek and Roman, kind of figures, not Thucydides, but now Achilles. We're really damaging ourselves here.
You couldn't bring us up to the Enlightenment.
No, I couldn't. I'm sorry. We're all still stuck there, either in ancient Greece or Rome.
No, that is fair. So I want to ask you about solutions. We've had so many people on this show, and they've left me wanting and actually terrified for the future of our republic. When you testified to the House in 2020, you said that when we are consumed by partisan rancor, we are vulnerable to external forces which can weaken our institutions and degrade our faith in democracy. You just touched on it. You explored it further in your new book, There's Nothing Here for You. What do you see as some solutions for this crisis in democracy? More pointed, how can we create a shared national identity and really restore the strength and the health of our republic?
Well, we need some demonstration effect, right? And I mean, it may not be coming from our politicians. I mean, we can all start to call our congressmen and women and send letters to them and, just say, look, please try to approach politics with less of the partisan rancor, reach across the aisle. But the algorithms of our politics are not propitious for that right now. I mean, they're pushing people towards taking extreme positions, basically looking at the other side of the aisle as the enemy. Everything's framed in terms of win, lose, victory, defeat, outrage, people kind of blowing up small issues into massive proportions. And again, as I said, every single thing being politicized. So I'm not so sure it's going to really come from the top, unless we do have members of Congress on both sides of the aisle having some kind of eureka moment and realizing that they're going to have to sort of step up to help save American democracy, not just whether they're going to have a win for the Democratic or the Republican Party, that, this is all at stake right now. So I think, it's going to have to be the rest of us to sort of step up here, doing more about what you're doing, for example, podcasts and other outreach activities, communications, discussions, trying to get people to engage as human beings and fellow Americans on issues with a bit more empathy, rather than, a discussion always has to end in the annihilation of somebody else's point of view. This is not kind of a zero-sum game all the time. How can we talk to each other instead of talking past each other? Can we kind of listen and hear what other people have to say? Can we accept their perspective and stop labeling everything? So you haven't used any labels, in this discussion here. And I'm trying very hard not to label anything at all in discussions that I'm having either. Can we kind of do things on a non-ideological basis? And how can we mobilize people to kind of step up and do something in their communities and as in the sort of state and local government level? Because we have to be able to show there that people can work together. There's been a lot of emphasis in some of the solutions that people are, grasping towards on public service, volunteering, getting out there, getting across the country and doing, some things outside of your comfort zone, outside of your state. How do we get people to see each other in action in different places? Because I'm pretty convinced if we get away from our computers, and of course it's a bit difficult with COVID, isn't it? I mean, we're having to do everything now by Zoom, or people are certainly listening more and more to podcasts, however, but hopefully they'll listen to people having sensible, empathetic, reasonable, civil conversations more. But we need to physically get people out there to do things together, to engage with each other. And we've seen some amazing feats of heroism and selflessness during the COVID pandemic. I mean, think about everybody who goes to work every single day in a hospital. And, no matter what, they just step up there and try to help people and to save people. Grocery stores, delivery drivers, volunteer firefighters out in California and in the West at the worst possible times. We know that Americans can stand up and do something and make a difference here. The question is just really how we scale it all up and how we bring it all together and network it. So, part of the end of the book is really sort of a challenge to all of us, myself included, to figure out, what more can we do? I mean, for me, I'm kind of thinking it's not sufficient to just be a national security expert and keep on pontificating about Putin and Russia. And, obviously that's still important because our national security is still important. But, what can I do in a concrete, meaningful way to, help to bridge some of these divides here? Who can I go out to talk to? Who can I go out and do something with? How can I use some of my own resources to, fund something, for example, to give people more opportunity or to bring people together? What can we all do in a concrete fashion? And I do try to lay some of this out in the book as well, with ideas of what people can do.
Thanks, Justin. And thank you, Dr. Hill, for joining us. I'm a huge fan and really excited and feel like I could ask you 1,000 questions, but I will have to settle for just one. And it concerns Mr. Putin and Russia and his seeming habit to collect disputed regions in recent years, most notably the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine, comprised of Lugansk and Donetsk, but and also in Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia, and to a lesser extent the Transnistria region in Moldavia, which is, of course, predates Putin. But you can see the attraction of having these disputed regions. It puts it makes it very, very hard to admit these regions into NATO, and also allows him to sort of turn up the heat whenever he wants. But it always seemed to me that they also represent vulnerabilities, very much as, if we would, I don't know, foment an insurrection in Tijuana or start a shooting war in Quebec. So, what, in your view, should be our strategy towards those regions, especially in eastern Ukraine and northern Georgia? And do you see any way we could sort of leverage those conflicts to our advantage?
Yeah, well, Greg, I mean, this is a great question, and clearly the question whether we can leverage them to our advantage is a very difficult one, because Putin is definitely, as you've laid out, leveraging them to his advantage and to Russia's advantage. I mean, these are really tools for dividing and conquering, in his view, and preventing Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, from moving towards the West in some fashion. And also, in the case of Crimea, for Russia, this is a way, and certainly he used this with the annexation of Crimea to bolster his own popularity, because there was always this kind of sense that Crimea was the province that had got away somehow from Russia, and that there was a sort of a rightful return element in the annexation. I mean, we wouldn't agree with this, but there's all mythologizing. It's kind of grown up around Crimea and its role in Russian history. The peninsula that was taken by Catherine the Great in the first instance from the Ottoman Empire becomes the location of the Black Sea Fleet, and on and on. It has a wartime mythology during the Second World War, kind of hero cities of pushing back against the Germans who also invade, and then also a very negative history with the expulsion of the Crimean Tatars, who were the indigenous people there by the Soviets and Stalin. A lot going on in Crimea, and not least the Crimean War with the UK, with Great Britain, back in the 19th century as well. The Crimea, more than anything, I think counts for Putin in wanting to sort of keep that back in the hegemony of Russia. There was a lot of leverage in internal politics that he played there, and he has no intention of letting Crimea go. That's clear. Donbass is, that's kind of a question mark. It's clear that Donbass is intended to be kept at a sort of simmering near boil to keep Ukraine down and to keep Ukraine, constantly kind of preoccupied and tied up in knots in its politics and economics, and as you were saying, prevent them from moving forward. In terms of what we can do on our own, it's very difficult because the Russians, again, have a tendency and Putin, to see things very negatively through a lens of us as the main antagonist. And so every time we do try to intervene in some way, I mean, in the mildest ways, and reach out in terms of figuring out how we can end some of these conflicts, it's immediately turned into some kind of proxy war or proxy of engagement with the United States. Russia being unwilling to compromise on some of the places that don't look so inflammatory because they always have to try to get a win over us. So I think that for the most part, we can only really address these persistent conflicts in tandem and in close cooperation with our European allies, not just NATO allies, but the rest of Europe, because of the kind of proximity for Europe there. They will always have a role, and we have to figure out very creatively about how we create more economic opportunity for engagement with these regions. Moldova has actually just had a recent election, which has kind of put it on a bit of a different footing there. So there is some prospect, but we have to be creative, and we certainly haven't to kind of give up on the idea that we can have Donbass reintegrated back into Ukraine, and certainly not recognizing the annexation of Crimea, and keep trying to encourage the Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine to look forward, not always look back, and diversify their relationships as well in the region to bolster their sovereignty.
Thank you for that question, Greg. We will go to Dr. Terry, and then we will go to Andy.
Thanks so much, Justin. And I'm so happy to have this opportunity to say thank you, Dr. Hill, for your integrity. But I have a question that relates to what I'm going to be lecturing tomorrow to my students about, which is immigration and security. And, one of the interesting things that we've seen over the last, well, not so much interesting, but really, 20 years since 9/11 is the securitization of immigration policy, but also just the impact that immigration has had in politics in the EU and so on, as well as, of course, here in the U.S. And yet we fail to see any movement towards some kind of global governance or even cooperation around immigration and refugee flows and so on. And I'm wondering Given that this has such a huge impact on security issues, if there's any hope that we might see more collaboration, particularly within NATO, and because of Turkey's dealing with refugees in Syria and the Afghanistan refugees and all of this, that we might see more collaboration on this topic in light of the security issues that are there. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Terry. I mean, I agree that this is one of the biggest challenges that we face right now. And it's not just really from wartime and sort of civil strife within societies that we're seeing across refugee flows. We're seeing more and more, a lot of the immigration being driven, and with refugees as well, being driven by climate change, and basically many parts of the world, including places very close to us, becoming almost uninhabitable. And that might be because of persistent drought or being hit by hurricanes. Major force over and over again, as we've sort of seen in the American Isthmus, places like Guatemala, Honduras, and elsewhere here. But look, we're seeing, encroaching desertification in and around the Mediterranean basin. Places, you've probably seen the recent report that came out of my old neck of the woods, and the Director of National Intelligence and National Intelligence Council and other, agencies that are kind of showing the countries at most risk from climate change, and they include Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, two countries that have been hit by war. Other places in the Middle East, Syria and elsewhere, Pakistan. We also know, of course, about lower-lying countries, Bangladesh and elsewhere. And hey, look, here in the United States, we're going to have coastal regions, huge swathes of the West and the South that are going to be hit by drought. With the refugees from fires, just massive displacement. It's not just going to be immigration from the outside, but it's kind of migration within states and also within regions like the European Union as a result of climate impacts. Already, obviously the Pentagon have been thinking about the national security consequences of climate change. When I was there in the kind of government and the National Intelligence Council, we were thinking about that. Rising waters and some of the threats to coastal defense installations, for example, and naval bases. So there's all kinds of dimensions of this, and I think you're absolutely right. We need to figure out how we're going to get a grip on this globally, because we have our own domestic impacts that we're going to have to deal with. We already are. Think about the number of places in the United States that have been hit multiple times by natural disasters. California has been having a bomb cyclone of massive flooding on top of fire. The Gulf Coast and Florida. How many times can you be hit, over and over again, the same spot by, hurricanes of such, huge magnitude? And then it's the neighboring countries and how they get impacted, and what happens when people are desperate and they're trying to leave, and where do they go? So for sure, we need to have a better domestic discussion about this, because we need to realize, why are people moving? It's desperation. It's not just, for a better life and an economic front. I came to the United States in a very different way, definitely for a better life. And, obviously I was sort of driven out to some degree by, one could look at it that way, from, by class and poverty. But I didn't come out of utter sheer desperation. And, the idea that this was kind of a life or death issue, like many people are coming to the United States and many people are going into Europe now. Great Britain is now seeing refugees coming across the Channel from the rest of Europe in ways that never had that before. The whole of the Mediterranean, the refugees and boats coming from Northern Africa and, from out of the Near East, the pace has never really subsided. So this is not going to go away, no matter how many times we kind of think about putting up barriers, physical barriers, or other kinds of barriers restricting visas, or immigration in the United States is at the lowest point that it's been in decades. Legal immigration, and the refugee flows, though, are going to keep on coming. So we're going to have to think long and hard about how we handle this. And hopefully, as you're teaching this in your class, we'll have some bright young students who will come up with some better ideas than we've got, because we certainly need them. But we need to treat this issue with a lot more strategic perspective. It's not going to go away. And also some empathy for the human beings that are basically behind all of this. Because people are generally desperate, and they're going to be increasingly so as time moves on.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Terry, and the answer, Dr. Hill. We have time for 2 more questions. We will go to Andy and then John Gunnison. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Justin. Thank you for joining us today. Dr. Hill, great to hear from you. Earlier this year, according to many media reports, Elon Musk did invite Vladimir Putin for a conversation here on Clubhouse. Now, I don't know if that happened. I'd love to know. Maybe someone can tell me or us. But given the furor surrounding social media in general here in the US and the UK at the moment, given that so many of the social media platforms are blocked in China at the moment, just generally Clubhouse and other social media platforms, or maybe even the foreign media as a whole, what is the Russian government's current view and stance on these platforms? Many thanks.
Well, it's a great question, Andy. And, they're also trying to move to block it too. They're coming up with new technical means of restricting information on the internet, because Putin sees that as a threat to his own position inside of Russia, just like the Chinese government do too. And of course, that should give us pause for thought, because as they close down access within their own polities, they continue to exploit access within ours through social media platforms. Our social media platforms are incredible tools for political influence for all kinds of, obviously, domestic actors, but also for external actors. And, I think obviously we're grappling with this right now with all the questions about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Francis Hogan, the whistleblower from Facebook, coming out and giving such detailed testimony at Congress. We're all realizing, that social media, I think we realized this a long time ago, is a double-edged sword. So when we look at what the Russians are doing and the Chinese are doing, I wouldn't necessarily suggest that we do anything like they, start instituting their policies in any way here. But this should be a strong signal that they're seeing dangers to their own politics, but their own personal positions in many respects of Vladimir Putin and President Xi and the kind of cliques around them. They don't want their power to be challenged. They know that the social media can be a very powerful tool for democratization. But it's also, as I said, been an incredibly useful instrument for them to bolster their own positions in our systems, basically to infiltrate and influence and penetrate our own political discourse. So we are going to have to think about long and hard about how we regulate social media platforms. I think it's going to be a real challenge for us. Because, there's also the domestic element of this, free speech, political activity. Also, our own political figures operate in the same kind of way. They want to have influence. They want to manipulate social media. They want to spread their own, forms of disinformation for domestic political purposes. But those the media platforms remain a door, a portal for external actors. So definitely, we're going to have to do something, and we should be very mindful of what China and Russia are doing, because as I said, Russia is now in the same process of creating its equivalent of the sort of a great Chinese firewall.
Thank you for that question, Andy. We will go to John Gunnison for the last question, and then I will ask Dr. Hill for her parting thoughts. Again, folks, she's the author of the recent book, There's Nothing Here for You. I suggest you all go out and buy it. It is a very good read. Mr. Gunnison, over to you. Bring us home.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. You've been speaking with us tonight here in Congress and in your book about the consumption of national security policy to domestic political interest. And I'm interested in asking you about a specific incident at the end of the Trump presidency, which was the strange transition at the Pentagon in the final 2 months. We know that the top civilian office holders were removed from their positions and replaced with last-minute appointees, including Chris Miller, Kash Patel, Anthony Tata, and others. The purpose of these maneuvers still seems like a mystery to many of us. The principals involved have claimed that they came into these jobs in an effort to expedite the Afghanistan withdrawal, but others have speculated that perhaps it was connected to the interest in overturning the election results. Because of your expertise in assessing leaders and their decisions, and also because you know many of the individuals involved from your time in the administration, can you give us a better understanding of what exactly happened and what was the purpose?
Well, I wish I could, John, because I have a lot of questions myself, including, why some of the people involved did it. Chris Miller, for example, I worked with really closely, and I was perplexed, to say the least, when he made the decision to take that job. Others, it was kind of more obvious that they had a lot of, just their personal ambition and, really thought the idea of getting into these positions was great, frankly, that they would be able to exert power and influence, maybe had, a whole series of personal agendas that they could push. But it certainly seemed to be at the expense of, our larger national security. And from the outside, and of course, this, I worked with one colleague at one point that it looked like Spinal Tap. It looked like a kind of a parody of the Pentagon at different points. It was really, I think, for a lot of people, not just inside but outside, dumbfounding. Nobody could figure out what was going on. And I think that really underscores that, we need to have inquiries into this, straightforward, fact-based, really trying to kind of get to the bottom of determining, which of these kind of many factors was at play here. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, yes, for sure. And I certainly think that Chris Miller was very focused from his work on counterterrorism, trying to get Austin Tice, back, for example, which I think we all want to do. There were a number of issues that, maybe they were focused on. But this overall question about then, what was the intent from the White House? What did President Trump and others think that they should be doing rather than what they actually really did? It's all part of that whole inquiry about what was happening in those kind of last months of the administration in terms of President Trump trying to stay on in power, and how did that all play in? So I really hope that we get to the bottom of these issues, because just like you, I'm sometimes mystified, especially sometimes when you know the players, it becomes even more confounding and perplexing, because you can't figure out what on earth were they doing here? What did they think they were doing? And we are now, I think, at one of these inflection points when it comes to the inquiry around January 6th and the storming of the Capitol building, where it's very important for the future of the country that we get answers to some of these questions. Because, we won't really be able to move on. So a lot of people saying, let's move on, let's move past this. But we can't. We have to know how these episodes came about and, what it kind of tells us about the risk, to our system of government moving forward. The United States has always been renowned for the competence of its government officials. Often, people can dispute people's policies, some of their particular preferences. But, from the outside, the U.S. system of government, members of Congress, the professionalism of all the staffs, the permanent employees, public servants, have always been seen as something of a model. And I don't think that's the case right now, because certainly these last few years have undermined not just a lot of American faith in the system of government, but a lot of the faith that others, put in us from the outside. People are still looking for American leadership. And we can lead by, kind of showing that we can get to the bottom of problems, that we can, be honest about some of the things that we've gone through and, figure out ways of changing some of the things to move forward in a more competent and, better fashion.
Thank you for that question, John. Dr. Hill, thank you very much for joining us. Again, author of There's Nothing Here for You, and also defender of democracy, little d there. I'm wondering, what do you want to leave the audience with? We ask all of our guests this. It can be positive, it could be negative, it could be somewhere in between. I have a feeling it's going to be positive, but what do you want to leave the thousands of listeners that have heard you speak tonight with?
Well, I'd want, everybody to kind of go out there and have more of these discussions with people in the way that we're having this, this is a sort of a civil, measured discussion. And we need more of this. We need to basically, be out there, reaching out across the country to get people engaged in, what could become a national debate about where are we going here? How do we all remember that we're all fellow Americans in a shared enterprise and, get over some of these divisions? So I think just having this podcast and having thousands of people, listening in, think about then each one of you about how you can go off and have a similar discussion. I mean, it doesn't have to be starting a podcast. There's a bit of a kind of a barrier to entry now in the kind of podcasting. I mean, I did think about that myself for a while. But I mean, how can you go out there and engage in conversations, either in, kind of Stanford in the kind of college setting, in the classroom, or with friends and colleagues, co-workers, and then think about, something concrete that we can all do together, or that you can do together, with your networks to, have a demonstration effect of the way you might be able to just change something. So that it's kind of like these building blocks. What can we do to push things forward in a more positive direction? Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, it appears that is all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Fiona for coming out, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. If you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, please visit our website, pm101.live or pm101.club. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team. Thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.